Zoya was born into a life of privilege, but fate had other plans. Her mother passed away when she was just a baby, leaving her in the care of her loving father, Mr. Ibrahim. He adored his daughter and did everything in his power to give her a happy life. Their home was warm, filled with laughter and love, and for the first few years of her life, Zoya knew nothing but joy. However, everything changed when Mr. Ibrahim decided to remarry. He believed that a mother's presence was important for Zoya, and when he met Layla, he was charmed by her beauty and gentle words. She seemed kind, affectionate, and eager to be a good mother to Zoya, but behind her sweet smiles, Layla harbored resentment. She despised Zoya, seeing her as nothing more than an obstacle standing in the way of her own ambitions. At first, she hid it well, pretending to care for the little girl while secretly manipulating situations to push her away from her father. She whispered doubts into Mr. Ibrahim's ears, making him believe that Zoya needed strict discipline, that she was too spoiled, too emotional. Slowly, she began planting the seeds of distance between them. Zoya, too young to understand, felt the shift, but couldn't explain it. The warmth in her father's eyes dimmed little by little, and though he still loved her, Layla's influence began to take hold. Zoya tried to win over her stepmother, eager to be loved. She followed her around, helped her with small tasks, and sought her approval. But Layla's kindness was only a mask, slipping at moments when no one else was watching. She would ignore Zoya's attempts, dismiss her affection, and sometimes, when frustration got the best of her, let sharp words slip, just enough to sting but never enough for Mr. Ibrahim to notice. Over time, the home that once felt safe began to feel unfamiliar. The love she had always known was now overshadowed by something she didn't understand, something cold, something cruel. And yet, Zoya held on to the hope that her father would always be there for her, unaware that the woman who had stepped into their lives was already plotting to take everything away from her. Layla's plan to get rid of Zoya started slowly, like poison spreading through water. She knew that as long as Zoya was in the house, she could never fully control Mr. Ibrahim. So, she began whispering in his ear, planting doubts in his mind. She told him that Zoya needed discipline, that she was too sheltered, too dependent on him. She convinced him that sending Zoya to a prestigious boarding school would be best for her future. At first, Mr. Ibrahim hesitated. He loved his daughter dearly and didn't want to send her away, but Layla was patient. Day by day, she played the role of the caring wife, who only wanted what was best for the family. Eventually, she won. Mr. Ibrahim, believing he was making the right decision, sent Zoya away, promising her that it was for her own good and that she would always have a home to return to. Zoya, heartbroken but trusting her father, wrote him letters every week. She told him how much she missed him, how she was trying to be strong, and how she longed to come back home. But those letters never reached him. Layla made sure of that. She tore them up before he could see them, erasing every word Zoya wrote. Days turned into months, and then into years, and with each passing day, Zoya felt more and more forgotten. She waited for a reply that never came, until she finally believed the worst, that her father had abandoned her, that he no longer wanted her in his life. Meanwhile, Layla played her part perfectly. She told Mr. Ibrahim that Zoya was too busy to write, that she was happy in her new life, and didn't wish to return. She filled his heart with guilt, making him believe that Zoya resented him for sending her away. Slowly, the bond between father and daughter faded, not because of distance, but because of the lies Layla spun so carefully. And while Mr. Ibrahim lived with regret, Layla used his weakness to take control of everything. She made decisions about the family business, managed the finances, and little by little, took complete control over the wealth that once rightfully belonged to Zoya. By the time Zoya realized what had happened, it was already too late. She had been erased from her own home, and Layla now stood in the place that was meant for her. One cold and dreadful night, Zoya received the news that shattered her world. Her father had passed away. The moment she heard it, her heart stopped. She couldn't believe it. She had spent years waiting to see him again, hoping that one day she would return home and everything would be as it once was. But now, that chance was gone forever. With tears streaming down her face, she packed her few belongings and rushed back home, desperate to say goodbye, to see him one last time. But when she arrived at the mansion, nothing was the same. The house that once welcomed her with warmth now felt cold and unfamiliar. The servants who had once cared for her looked away as if they didn't know her. And then she saw Layla, standing tall in the doorway, dressed in mourning black. But there was no grief in her eyes, only victory. Before Zoya could even step inside, Layla's sharp words cut through the air like a knife. She told her she had no place there, no right to enter. Confused and heartbroken, Zoya demanded to see her father, to mourn him. But Layla only laughed cruelly. She told everyone gathered that Zoya was not his daughter, just a distant relative, an orphan with no claim to anything. The people around them murmured, some shocked, some doubtful, but Layla's power over them was strong. She held documents, forged papers, that erased Zoya's name from everything. The house, the wealth, the inheritance. Everything had been transferred to Layla. Zoya's hands trembled as she tried to protest, but there was no one to listen. The doors of her own home were slammed shut in her face, leaving her standing outside in the darkness, alone and broken. The same streets she had once passed in a carriage were now the only place left for her. She had nothing. No family, no money, no shelter. Layla had stolen everything, even her identity. As the cold wind blew against her, Zoya realized the painful truth. She had lost everything. But deep inside her, beneath all the pain and betrayal, a fire had begun to burn. Layla had taken her home, but she would not take her spirit. One day, Zoya vowed, she would return, and when she did, Layla would regret ever crossing her. Zoya wandered the streets with nowhere to go, the cold night air biting at her skin. The world around her felt cruel and unforgiving. People who once knew her as the daughter of the wealthy Mr. Ibrahim now looked past her as if she were invisible. Some whispered, some pitied her, but no one reached out a hand to help. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and exhaustion weighed her down, but she had no choice but to keep moving. After days of struggling, she found shelter in a small orphanage run by kind-hearted women who took in abandoned children and the helpless. Though the place was far from the luxury she once knew, it was a roof over her head and a place to sleep. But life was not easy. She had to work for every meal, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and running errands just to earn her keep. The food was scarce, and some nights she went to bed hungry. There were days when she felt humiliated, when people treated her like she was worthless, like she didn't belong anywhere. The pain of losing everything weighed on her, but she refused to let it crush her spirit. Through every hardship, through every sleepless night and every cruel word thrown at her, Zoya held on to one thing: her anger. It burned deep inside her, fueling her will to survive. She would not be broken. She would not let Layla win. She vowed to herself that she would rise again, stronger than before, and take back everything that was stolen from her. Layla thought she had erased her, but she had only made her stronger. And one day, Zoya promised, she would return, not as a helpless girl, but as a storm that would destroy everything Layla had built. Zoya spent years struggling to survive, working any job she could find just to afford a meal. One of those jobs was at a small cafe where she worked long hours cleaning tables, serving customers, and earning just enough to get by. It was exhausting, but she never complained. She had learned to hide her pain behind a quiet determination. She had lost everything, but she was still standing. One evening, as she was wiping down a table, she noticed an elderly man sitting alone in the corner. He looked tired, deep in thought, and barely touched his coffee. Something about him reminded her of her father, perhaps the way he stared into the distance, lost in his worries. Without thinking, she approached him. "Is everything okay, sir?" she asked gently. The man, Mr. Adil, a powerful businessman known to many, looked up in surprise. No one had ever asked him that before. They started talking, and to his amazement, Zoya spoke with intelligence and wisdom far beyond her years. She had learned about business from watching her father, and though she had never been given a formal education in it, she understood its workings better than most. Impressed by her resilience, sharp mind, and unwavering determination, Mr. Adil saw something in her: potential. He asked about her life, and though she didn't reveal everything, she told him enough for him to realize she was a girl who had lost everything but refused to give up. The next day, Mr. Adil returned with an offer that would change her life. He would sponsor her education, give her a job in his company, and provide her with the opportunity to rebuild her future. At first, Zoya couldn't believe it. After all the suffering, Was fate finally giving her a chance? But she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the opportunity with both hands, determined to make something of herself, not just for survival, but for the revenge she had sworn to take. Zoya threw herself into her studies, learning everything she could about business, law, and strategy. She absorbed knowledge like a sponge, training herself to be powerful, to be unbreakable. She was no longer the helpless girl Layla had thrown away. Every lesson, every skill she gained, was a step closer to the day she would return to take back what was rightfully hers. Layla had destroyed her past, but Zoya was building a future that would destroy Layla in return. As Zoya worked hard to rebuild her life, she never let go of the past. The thought of Layla living in luxury while she had suffered on the streets fueled her determination. She had always believed that Layla had stolen her home and wealth, but one question haunted her: her father's death. Something about it never felt right. The news of his passing had been sudden, unexpected. He had always been a healthy man, full of life. How could he have died so suddenly? The more she thought about it, the more she felt that there was a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. One evening, after a long day of studying, Zoya received an unexpected message. It was from an old family servant, someone who had worked in her house for years but had disappeared after her father's death. The message was short but enough to send chills down her spine. "There is something you need to know about your father's death. Meet me." Heart pounding, she met the servant in a secluded place, away from prying eyes. The old man looked nervous, as if he had been carrying a heavy burden for years. His hands trembled as he handed her a small box. "I should have spoken earlier," he whispered, "but I was afraid. Layla is dangerous." Inside the box were documents, medical reports, and an old, tattered diary, her father's. As she read through the pages, her worst fears came true. Her father had suspected Layla. He had written about feeling weak, dizzy, and unwell for months before his death. He had planned to go for a checkup, but before he could, he had died in his sleep. The medical reports confirmed it. Traces of poison had been found in his system, but Layla had hidden the results. Tears filled Zoya's eyes as she realized the horrifying truth. Layla hadn't just stolen her home and wealth. She had murdered her father to take everything. A deep, burning rage took over her. This was no longer just about revenge. This was about justice. Her father's death would not go unpunished. Layla thought she had buried the truth, but Zoya had uncovered it. And now, she would make sure the whole world knew what Layla had done. Years passed, and Zoya was no longer the helpless girl who had been thrown out onto the streets. She had transformed into a powerful, confident woman. With Mr. Adil's guidance, she had built a successful career, mastering business, law, and strategy. She was no longer a victim. She was a force to be reckoned with. But despite all her success, there was one thing she had never forgotten: Layla. Every step she took, every skill she learned, was for this moment. Now, it was time to return and take back what was rightfully hers. But she couldn't return as Zoya, the abandoned daughter. Layla had erased that girl from existence. Instead, she created a new identity, a wealthy investor with no ties to the past. She dressed differently, spoke with confidence, and carried herself like a woman of power. No one would recognize the girl who had once begged for shelter on the streets. Her first move was to buy shares in Layla's company, the very business that had once belonged to her father. Slowly, without revealing herself, she gained control, step by step, until she held enough power to shake Layla's world. Layla, now desperate for investors, heard about this mysterious businesswoman and saw an opportunity. She had no idea who Zoya really was. All she saw was wealth and influence, exactly what she needed to keep her company afloat. Layla welcomed Zoya with open arms, believing she had found a powerful ally. She tried to charm her, just as she had once fooled Mr. Ibrahim. She invited her to lavish parties, spoke sweet words, and even sought her advice. But Zoya played along, hiding her true emotions behind a polite smile. Every handshake, every conversation was a step closer to her final goal, Layla's downfall. Layla had once stolen everything from her, but now, without even realizing it, she was letting Zoya into her world. And when the time was right, Zoya would strike, ensuring that Layla lost everything just as she once had. The game had begun, and this time Zoya held all the cards. Zoya had waited years for this moment, and now it was time to strike. She had spent months gaining Layla's trust, pretending to be her ally, listening to her secrets, and learning every weakness she could exploit. Layla, blinded by greed, never suspected anything. She saw Zoya as her savior, the wealthy investor who could rescue her struggling business. But Zoya had no intention of saving her. She was there to destroy her. The first blow came swiftly. Using the information she had gathered, Zoya exposed Layla's corruption to the world. She leaked evidence of fraud, shady business deals, and unpaid debts. Investors pulled out one by one, major contracts were cancelled, and banks froze Layla's accounts. Suddenly, the empire Layla had built on lies began to crumble. She tried to stop it, but it was too late. As the walls of her world came crashing down, Layla grew desperate. She sold whatever she could to cover her losses, but it wasn't enough. Her debts piled up, and one by one, she lost everything. The final blow came when she was forced to sell the one thing she never thought she would lose: her mansion, the very house she had stolen from Zoya. But the moment the deal was finalized, Layla was hit with the biggest shock of all. The buyer was none other than the mysterious investor she had trusted, Zoya. She had unknowingly handed back the very home she had stolen, right into the hands of the girl she had once thrown onto the streets. With nowhere else to turn, Layla swallowed her pride and went to beg for help. She arrived at the mansion, pleading for mercy, unaware that the woman sitting across from her was the same girl she had betrayed years ago. She saw only a powerful, wealthy businesswoman, someone who could save her. But Zoya sat back, watching Layla's desperation with cold, quiet satisfaction. Layla had no idea who she was begging for help, and soon, Zoya would reveal the truth in a way Layla would never forget. The night had finally arrived. Layla's time was up. The mansion that she had stolen, the wealth she had built on lies, everything was slipping from her grasp. She had tried to fight, to find a way out of her downfall, but nothing worked. Now, she was being forced to leave, humiliated and powerless. Just when she thought things couldn't get worse, she received a message, a summons to the mansion, the very home she was about to lose. The new owner wanted to see her. Desperate for any last chance to save herself, she rushed there, unaware that this meeting would change everything. As Layla stepped inside, the grand halls felt different, almost haunting. She walked into the room where the new owner waited, and there, sitting in the chair of power, was the woman she had trusted, the investor she had begged for help. But as she looked closer, something felt familiar. The way she sat, the fire in her eyes, the way she held herself with quiet confidence. It sent a chill down Layla's spine. Then, the woman spoke, and her voice brought back a past Layla had long buried. "I am Zoya." Layla's breath caught in her throat. Her body froze. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. The girl she had thrown out onto the streets, the orphan she had erased, was standing before her, not as a beggar, but as a queen who had come to reclaim her throne. Horror filled Layla's eyes as realization struck her like a thunderbolt. Zoya watched Layla's face pale, and then, without a word, she threw a stack of documents onto the table. "Read them," she said coldly. With shaking hands, Layla picked them up, her eyes widening as she scanned the pages. Bank records, fraud reports, legal documents. But then, at the very bottom, she saw something even more terrifying: evidence of her worst crime. The truth about Mr. Ibrahim's death. The poison. The hidden medical reports. The betrayal she thought would never be uncovered. Layla staggered back, her legs weak beneath her. "No, this can't be," she whispered, her voice breaking. She looked up at Zoya, panic in her eyes. "Please, I did what I had to. I was desperate." Zoya stood, her expression as cold as ice. "You stole my life. You stole my home. And worst of all, you stole my father." Her voice didn't shake, didn't soften. "Now, it's time for you to face the consequences." Layla fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Zoya, Please, forgive me. I'll do anything. I'll leave. I'll disappear. Just don't. But Zoya only stared down at her, unmoved. Layla had shown no mercy when she had thrown her out. And now, Zoya had none to give. Justice had finally caught up with her, and there was no escape. Layla's pleas for mercy meant nothing to Zoya. She had waited too long for this moment, fought too hard to let Layla escape justice. Without hesitation, Zoya handed over the final piece of evidence to the authorities, proof of fraud, corruption, and worst of all, the murder of Mr. Ibrahim. The law had ignored Layla's crimes for years, but now the truth was undeniable. The arrest warrant was issued immediately. The next morning, as the sun rose over the village, police arrived at Layla's mansion, now Zoya's home. The once powerful woman, who had ruled with lies and greed, was dragged out in handcuffs, her cries echoing through the streets. The villagers gathered, whispering among themselves, shocked by the truth that had come to light. They had believed Layla's lies, had thought Zoya was nothing more than a forgotten girl, an outsider, but now they saw the reality. Zoya was always the rightful heir, the true daughter of Mr. Ibrahim, and Layla, she was nothing but a thief and a murderer. As Layla was forced into the police car, she turned one last time to look at Zoya. Her eyes were filled with fear, regret, and disbelief. She had never imagined that the girl she had abandoned would rise so high, strong enough to destroy her. Zoya met her gaze with quiet, unwavering strength. There was no hatred in her eyes, only justice. Layla had taken everything from her once, but in the end she had taken nothing at all. With Layla gone, Zoya finally reclaimed what was hers: her father's name, her family's honor, and the home that had been stolen from her. But she did not let her heart be consumed by revenge. Instead of living in bitterness, she chose to turn her pain into something meaningful. The grand mansion, once a symbol of her suffering, became a home for orphans, a place where no child would ever feel abandoned, as she once had. Walking through the halls of her father's home, Zoya felt a deep sense of peace. She had fought her battle, won her war, and now she was free. She looked out at the sunrise, the golden light spilling into the room, and for the first time in years, she smiled. She stole my life, my family, and my happiness, but in the end, she could never steal my destiny.